Okay, so I am Susan Mobley. The title on your program is slightly different than what you see on the screen before you, mainly because I had no idea what I was doing until the last moment, and then I decided what I wanted to talk about was basically to give you some context for education during the Reformation era, and I want to focus principally upon what Luther and Melanchthon did in reforming education, but in order to understand that, I have to give you a slightly larger context. So let's start with the geographical context. This is a map of, technically in this particular period, it's called the Holy Roman Empire, which is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, but we're stuck with the label. So it's you see the red line? That's the Holy Roman Empire. It is sort of the same as modern Germany today, but not exactly. So the specific area that we're going to be focusing on, I'm going to have to mark in one mic, is right here. So this is Württemberg. Now the map is color-coded according to confessions. There are 3 confessions represented on this map: Catholic, Calvinist, and Lutheran. The Catholic is green. The Calvinist is purple. The Lutheran is yellow. What do you notice about the geographical patterns of Lutheranism? North. So Lutheranism is in the northern part of Germany and into Scandinavia. So you notice that Württemberg is kind of hanging out all by itself, and it's surrounded by Catholics and Calvinists. So this is actually going to affect a lot of how the Reformation unfolded in Württemberg. So I'm going to walk you through that in terms of education. But before I talk about that, we're going to head north, and we're going to head up to Saxony, and we're going to talk about what's going on in Wittenberg with Luther and Melanchthon. So this particular period witnessed what some scholars have called a revolution in education. Charles Nauert has said that in the entire history of Western civilization, there have only been a handful of curricular revolutions on this particular level. Louis Spitz once remarked that in no other era other than our own has so much interest been paid to education as in the Renaissance and Reformation periods. So there's a lot of similarities between our era and theirs. So what is this revolution in education? Well, this is it. So on the right, you see the medieval curriculum. And if you count, you'll notice that there are 8, because I'm going to add natural philosophy for a reason I'll explain in a second. And then we'll talk about the left column in just a second. That's what happened in the Renaissance, specifically in Italy, but these ideas are going to head north at the end of the 15th and into the 16th century. So you have there the 7 liberal arts, the trivium, the quadrivium. This education we're going to find developing in Europe at the same time that Rome is falling. So for a ballpark figure, let's say 500 AD. The medieval period goes probably till about 1500 AD. And it's not like everyone woke up on January 1st, 1500 AD. Ooh, we're in early modern era. Yeah, it's not that. It's a very much more gradual transition. But it's a good kind of marker. So quick math check, how many years is that? 500 AD to 1500 AD. It's 1,000 years. And you think nothing changed in education for 1,000 years? Yeah, no. So I'm going to explain, I'm going to give you some pictures to explain kind of the transitions in medieval education from the beginning until the eve of the Reformation. Then we're going to talk about this whole Renaissance thing and why education shifted here in this particular moment in time. Okay, so pictures are worth 1,000 words, so here we go. What is this? Not just a church, it's a monastery. What do we know about monasteries? Who lives in monasteries? Monks. What do monks do? Pray, read, think. But they also did one really, really important thing for Western civilization. They preserved the classical past. So if next time you see a monk, give them a big hug. Because without them, a lot of the classical texts that we use in our schools, we would not have. So the point I'm trying to make is the monasteries, and if you look, this is Bobbio. This is in the Apennines, it's in Italy. It's one of the earlier Benedictine monasteries in Europe. They tend to be in remote places, and they're self-contained communities, but they tend to have connections with other communities and other places. Let me give you an example. One of the most famous monks in the Middle Ages is Bede. You may know him as the Venerable Bede. He is in the monastery of Yarrow, which is way north in England. If you go any further north, you're in Scotland. He was a great pen pal. He had friends all over Europe, and his favorite thing to do was to exchange books. So what they would do is, one monk would send a manuscript to Bede. It would be copied and then sent back. Bede would send a manuscript to somebody else, they would copy it, and then they'd send it back. It's kind of like interlibrary loan. It's just you made a copy of the book before you sent it back. So this is how we're going to share information. Now, how do you think that's going to happen? Think about this. How are we copying those manuscripts? By hand. What are we using to write them with? Yeah, or some sort of writing instrument. What are we writing on? Which is made out of what? So it's really expensive, right? So this is going to contain learning because of the expensive nature of writing materials. So it's going to limit the dissemination of information. So basically, medieval education in its beginnings was aimed at the preservation of learning. And because these are religious communities, they're really designed for the religious life. So they have a purpose in the larger society, but they're sort of inwardly contained. So in this particular context, what you need to know how to do is, in the beginnings, they're reading the scriptures, and they're eventually going to then start reading other theologians. So being able to read Latin, really important. So that trivium is very important, the grammar, logic, rhetoric. Okay, this is Rothenberg on Taube. What is the first thing you notice about this? Walls? Yes, the church is in the center. What does that tell us about the way society is structured, oriented? Where are the resources going? The church. So medieval education not only is maintained by the church, it is the preserve of the church, is for the church. So what we're designing, what we are preparing students to do is to serve the church in some capacity. Now, because the church is the only place that you can get education, a lot of these men are going to get drafted into secular service. As we increasingly come to rely upon writing for like contracts, relationships, law, we need people who can read and write. So a lot of the people working for secular rulers are actually clerical. But our education really is designed, the pinnacle of knowledge, the queen of sciences is theology. So the one transition that happened in the Middle Ages, there was a little event that happened, 1095 is when we started. We thought it was a wonderful idea to go over and try to recapture the Holy Land from the infidels. It was a wonderful idea. It didn't play out so well. But one of the byproducts of the Crusades was the rediscovery of Aristotle. That is going to change education. Now, I know some of you prefer Plato. But Aristotle has an advantage for an educator in this period that Plato does not. He wrote about everything. And he wrote about everything in a system, so everything is linked. So this is going to become the foundation for education until the Renaissance. So that's where we get scholastic theology. So we are training students to study scholastic theology, and this is why if you look at that list, you see what happened to logic? Do you notice that it's in all caps? This becomes the most important subject in the medieval curriculum toward the end of the Middle Ages. Natural philosophy is studied throughout the Middle Ages, but it also becomes increasingly important. Okay, now this is the Renaissance. This is Siena. What do you notice about this particular, it's a city, so what do you notice about, I showed you a picture of another city, right? I showed you a picture of this city. What's different about this city? What's in the center? Yes, this is called the Piazza. Do you notice the really large tower? That's on the City Hall. There is a church. What do the respective sizes tell you? We're shifting our emphasis. Now remember that the Renaissance is a word that literally means rebirth. What is being reborn is classical culture, and one of the ideas that was revived is the notion of self-government. So that the citizens are responsible for making their own laws, governing their society, keeping things orderly. Now this is opposite from the medieval period, which is very hierarchical, right? You got the king on top, and everything else flows down. The king is appointed by God, he's responsible to God. God will remove him if he doesn't adhere to his duties. This is different. So, in Renaissance Italy, we had profound political, social, and economic changes. So if you look at this, what kind of education do we need? What do our students need to know in order to function in this society? Rhetoric. Being able to speak, not only publicly, but maybe one-on-one. And what is one of the key strategies, key objectives of rhetoric? Persuasion. But in rhetoric, proper rhetoric, you don't want to rely upon persuading people using emotions. You want to persuade people using reason. So can you see our list? Can you see dialectic? Dialectic is almost the same thing as logic, but you could argue it's more closely aligned to rhetoric. Being able to see both sides of an issue, in other words. Okay, what else do we need to know how to do? If the citizens are making their own laws, what do they need to know to make good laws? The past. History. Where we went right, where we went wrong. What else do we need to know to make good laws, to have an orderly society? We need to know something about right and wrong. So we need to know something about moral philosophy. So we're working within a Christian context, but a lot of the texts we're going to be using are classical. So Cicero's De Officiis, for example, is going to be one of the key texts here. So can you see how our curriculum shifted? Because society shifted, right? So Renaissance education is really designed to produce an active citizen. Okay, now we want to pause right here for a moment and remind ourselves that in both the Middle Ages and the early modern period, the number of people who required an education is very, very small. Very small percentage of the population receive formal education. And that won't change for quite some time. Okay, so it's in this context that Luther and Melanchthon are going to create Lutheran education. So I'll talk about it in a second. Are there any questions about this curriculum revolution? I'm assuming silence means we're good. Okay, so when Luther protested much of Catholic theology, he was criticizing scholastic theology. So once you do that, he started with an implicit criticism of contemporary education, and that very quickly became explicit. And if you read, and Melanchthon also has some comments about education, but Luther was a little more vocal about the education he received. It's worth reading when he says it's hilarious even 500 years later. So all reformers are going to realize the importance of education for the reform movement. So for Lutherans, Luther and Melanchthon are the two most important ones. We're going to have others of them later, but at the beginnings, these are the two most important ones. It's important to note that Luther's view of education is neither medieval nor Renaissance. Melanchthon's view of education is neither medieval nor Renaissance. And I'm going to explain that in just a second. They're influenced by both, but you can't say that they're one or the other. Because both received training in what you could argue is a medieval education, but they were both influenced by these new ideas as well, to differing degrees. All right, so before we go on, I just want to point out quickly some characteristics of Lutheran education. And any of you Lutheran educators in the room should look at this list and say, oh, that looks really familiar. So the one thing I want to note that you may not have considered, I believe what the Lutherans did, and Melanchthon did the heavy lifting here because Luther was busy writing all kinds of other things about theological matters. What they did was to combine the 7 medieval liberal arts with the Renaissance program of education. So they basically took the best from both and created a distinctive education. Now, the reason they had to do this is because there were things in Renaissance education that their students needed to know in order to study Protestant theology. So what is the essential element? What's the foundation of Protestant theology? What do you have to know in order to study Protestant theology?
What do you mean by Protestant theology?
Lutheran theology. So if you want to understand Lutheran theology, where do you have to start? Scriptures. Yeah, scriptures. And we want to read them in which languages? The original ones. So Hebrew and Greek. So that's what the Renaissance humanists were all about. Ad fontes. Read everything in the original. Don't read a summary or a commentary on a summary or a summary on a commentary. Read the original thing. So there are things, and again, we want to create active citizens. So if you listen to both Luther and Melanchthon, they want to prepare people for active service to the church and the society. So that's a very Renaissance idea. But a lot of the things that they're doing are also in that 7 liberal arts from the medieval era. Okay, so the initial reforms of education are going to occur at the theological level. That seems self-apparent, right? I mean, there's something wrong with Catholic theology, we have to fix it. But now, let me tell you something about medieval universities. They're not like universities today. There are only 4 faculties in a university in this particular period. You have theology, law, medicine, and something called the arts. Theology, law, and medicine are the upper faculties, so you could think of them as like graduate level. The arts, you could consider it the undergraduate. It's not exactly the same, but it's the best correlation we have. So if you change your theological curriculum, what problem is that going to create? Yes, they're going to have an arts program that's not designed for this new theology. So you're going to have to go down and fix the arts program. Now, once you do that, it's also going to affect law and medicine because those students are going to be going from the arts program into law and medicine. So again, it's kind of a trickle-down effect. Once we change theology and what students are studying, we have to change how they're prepared. So again, one of the key things that they have to know before they get to theology studies are those languages. And any of you who have, as adult learners, attempted to master a foreign language, how did that work out for you? It is really, really hard. So the younger you start, the easier it is. So the way we're going to reform education is, it basically is you could argue it's a 3-step process. So we're going to start at the university level. We're going to start with theology, work our way down to the arts. Then we're going to realize that students are coming up to the university and they're not prepared even for this new instruction in arts. So we're going to have to create an intermediate level of education. In the 16th century, that's called the Pedagogium. It's the forerunner of the modern German gymnasium. So this is your intermediate instruction. So this is specifically designed to prepare people for university studies. Well, then we were discovering that people were arriving at the Pedagogium and they weren't prepared for the studies at the Pedagogium. So now we have to go back and fix the elementary level of education. So this is your 3-step program. So I'm going to tell you how this played out in the Duchy of Württemberg. I just had to put the coat of arms because it's just beautiful. I do want to put up this, the motto is Attempto. There's a couple of different ways you can translate that in Latin. You can translate it as I attack, I assail, or I try. I think that it was supposed to mean I attack, but as we're going to find out, I try might work better. So Württemberg is really interesting. If the modern soap operas would ever get wind of this, it would be a great story. So we have Ulrich, that's the guy on the right, and he has delusions of grandeur. And he decides he wants to conquer and annex surrounding territories. So there's this, it's called the Palatinate War. One of the cities that's put under siege is Breton. That's Melanchthon's hometown. And Melanchthon was actually in it at the time it was put under siege. The other property he acquired was the monastery of Malbrunn, and I have a picture of that in a second. So as a result of all these infractions, and there's a really long list of infractions, Ulrich is tossed out of his duchy in 1519. Control reverts to the Habsburgs. Okay, does anyone know who the Habsburgs are? They're from Austria-Hungary in the modern period. This is probably the most important dynastic family in Europe at the time. The ruler at this particular time is a guy named Charles V. And Charles V did something that no other ruler in European history ever, he's the only one who did it. He wore 2 crowns. He was the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain. So the Habsburgs, the one thing you want to note about them is they're very Catholic. So as soon as the Habsburgs move into Württemberg, they're going to do whatever they can to make it as Catholic as they can make it. So Ulrich is going to manage to return and reclaim his duchy in 1534 with Protestant assistance. So he's Protestant, he's turned Lutheran. But when he returns to Württemberg, he's going to find that the University of Tübingen, which is the main university the only university in the duchy, is completely Catholic. I mean, it's scholastic, it's stodgy, it's like turn back the clock 200 years. So this is the situation that Ulrich faces when he returns to his duchy, introduces the Reformation. So the first thing he wants to do is to reform the curriculum along these new lines laid down by Luther and Melanchthon. And he's actually going to call in Melanchthon as a consultant. There's only one slight problem. The Lutherans are involved in a conflict with the Sacramentarians at the time, and this is going to prevent Melanchthon from coming to Tübingen officially. Luckily, he has a friend who's a professor of Greek there, Joachim Camerarius. So under the pretext of visiting an old friend, he comes to Tübingen and he examines the situation and he writes he gives the Duke a whole list of advice for what to do to fix the situation. The other thing he's going to do is he's going to write a frantic letter, and it is fairly frantic, to Johannes Bruns. To summarize, he's going to say that the world is going to end if Johann Bruns doesn't show up in Württemberg and help clean up the mess. So this is Bruns over here on the left. He was exaggerating, but it worked. Bruns showed up. So then our next step is we want to try to establish a state system of schools. And this is where that motto, attempto, comes in. And it means I try because it didn't work. Now, it's not entirely Ulrich's fault. He had a few problems. So this is one of the things you want to remember about the Reformation. And as a historian of education, I'm constantly reminded that education is about ideas, but it's about more than ideas. Education is not just ideas. It always operates within a context, and it's responsive or influenced by external factors. So saying that we're a Lutheran duchy and we're going to have Lutheran education is one thing, but actually implementing it is something very different. So here's why it took so long in Württemberg. We had the Schmalkaldic War between 1546 and 1548. Ulrich was fighting on the side of the Protestants. They lost. But when the problem for Ulrich is once he returned to his duchy, he did so as a vassal of the Holy Roman Emperor. So by going to war with the Holy Roman Emperor, he actually had violated his oath, which is really big. This is a really big deal in this particular period, to violate an oath. So not only is Württemberg have to pay a war indemnity, they have occupation forces in Württemberg, and this is Ferdinand, this is Charles V's brother, is going to initiate proceedings, imperial proceedings against Ulrich, basically trying to deprive him of the duchy yet again. So you see how complicated the whole thing is. I mean, it seems like it should be so simple. We'll just create a program of education and we'll implement it. But not so simple. The turning point is the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which is going to grant the authority for rulers in the Holy Roman Empire to choose the religion of their particular realm. So if you're the Duke of Bavaria and you're Catholic, you have the full legal right to make everybody in your territory Catholic. If you're the Duke of Württemberg and you're Lutheran, you have the full right to make everyone in your duchy Lutheran. So this is where we're going to see the changes, not only because of the Peace of Augsburg, but because of this guy. This is Christoph. This is the son of Ulrich. He is considered one of the two greatest rulers in Württemberg history. So it's under his guidance that we're going to get a state church in Württemberg that's Lutheran to this very day. And we're also going to get a state system of education that actually serves as the model for other places in Germany. So I put up this term in German because it's kind of hard to translate into English, Landesvater. I mean, you could say father of the country, but then we think George Washington. What this really means is that Christoph, as a ruler, saw himself as the father of his people. So this is going to convey a responsibility not only for their well-being in terms of peace and order, but also in terms of their spiritual well-being. So that means that he's going to protect the church, and part of the mission then is to spread the gospel. So this is why education is so important, because that's the best means by which to do that. So two things are going to happen simultaneously, and they're going to happen in this document that I have here at the bottom of the list, the Grosse Kirchenordnung from 1559. If you translate that, you could get great or large church ordinance. Either one would work because the thing is 568 pages. It sets up an entire state church, a liturgy, oversight, administration, connection with the state, I mean the whole 9 yards. And there's a large section in there called Of the Schools. So it's going to set out a program of education, a system of education, which we had never had before. So you have lots of schools in Europe, but the relationship between them is very murky. It's not clear, where one's responsibilities curriculum-wise start and stop. So there's a lot of unevenness in education. Now, we know this because if you read the section of the schools, it's based upon observation. So they didn't just make this out of a vacuum. They actually had conducted visitations of the schools in the duchy, and basically cataloging strengths and weaknesses. So the order of schools that's presented in 1559 is really based upon practical observation and an acknowledgement of some of the greatest shortcomings in the educational system, and one of those is how all the schools relate to each other. So we're going to set up a system of education that's organized from the very beginning all the way up to the university level. So the 4 types of schools that are mentioned in the Grosse Kirchenordnung are and it's called different things at different points in time. This particular document calls it the Partikularschulen. That's the Latin schools. Think grammar schools. Then you have the monastic schools. I'll talk about that in just a second. The Pedagogium and the university. Now, the university curriculum is not in this document because in this particular period, universities were semi-autonomous institutions. So the Duke couldn't just mandate, you do this, and you do this. Because they're academics, and a PhD in this particular period conferred a very high status upon the individual because they're so rare. So the Duke is going to have to negotiate separately with the university to get some of these reforms in place. But the rest of the schools he has authority over. Okay, so that's Mobley. So these monastic schools, and I was just kind of chuckling, I was having a conversation yesterday about a new scholarship program to identify some of the best and brightest students at the high school level, and then encourage them to go into classical studies, which may or may not lead into theological studies. And I was kind of chortling to myself, I'm like, oh, it's a 16th century Stift all over again. So what's going to happen in the 16th century in Württemberg, we're going to take those monasteries, we don't need them anymore, we're Protestant, but they're such lovely facilities, we should use them. So we're going to turn them into boarding schools. And they're boarding schools for scholarship students. So they actually have, and this is so German because they're so organized, they have something called a Staatsexamen. So there's a state test that students can take, and the students who score really well on it are offered the opportunity to enter this scholarship program. The catch is, of course, they have to study theology and become a pastor. So Kepler was a student at this particular monastic school of Mobley. Okay, so then we're going to organize our Latin schools. We're going to be using a model. I mean, if you read the document, it's a lot like what was going on with Johann Sturm in Strasbourg. The emphases are slightly different, and I'll try to point some of those out as we go along the way. But basically what we're going to do is we're going to set up an ordered progression of studies. So we're going to start with the beginning, and then each class is going to work students to more advanced material. Now this seems sort of self-evident, right? Duh, why wouldn't you do it that way? Well, we hadn't done it that way. So this is setting up an order where there had not been one. And the document is very specific about how that should be done. And I have an example on another slide, and I'll show you. Okay, so if you're a student, you would begin your education at the Trivial or the Partikularschulen. Those are your grammar schools. Then you would be promoted to the Pedagogium. In Württemberg, there are two of them. There's one in Stuttgart, and that's where the state government is located. And there's one attached to the University of Tübingen. And then from the Pedagogium, you could enter higher studies at the university level. Right around 1557, 1559, completion of the Pedagogium will result in a baccalaureate degree. So again, we're going to organize how students get from one level to the next. And it has to do with mastery of material, not seat time. So in an earlier session, we were talking about social promotion. Yeah, we didn't do that. You didn't get to move on until you had mastered whatever material was stipulated for that particular class. So that when you got to the next class, you were ready for that material. So what is different, I think, and I'm still kind of working my way through this, there is a greater emphasis upon religious instruction, and I hesitate to use the word faith development, but for lack of a better term, I will, in this particular program of education than you find in Sturm. I mean, Sturm has stuff about, reading the Bible, going to church, listening to a sermon, but he doesn't mention the catechism, he doesn't mention any doctrinal statement. It's kind of, it's Renaissance education. It's like it's prepared for a world in which there's only one church. And this education was in a world in which there is more than one church. And so the distinction is quite clear in the document, that we are preparing students specifically with a Lutheran education. And I have some excerpts I'll show in just a minute. So in other words, teaching truth is a very important component of this educational program, and the truth is defined as Lutheran. Grammar is going to be the core element in this particular educational program. If you don't know Latin grammar, you're not going to get a very good education because you won't be able to understand anything that's going on in the classes. Okay, so we're going to go really quickly through this. I basically just want you to see that Latin is really important, and that we start with the simplest level, and we work our way up, and we gradually add subjects as we go along once we think students are ready for them. So you'll notice in the first class, what are we doing? Well, what do you start with in preschool and kindergarten? You start with the alphabet, right? We're going to then gradually add parts of grammar, and then we'll get more advanced studies in grammar. So it's foundational. You master this, you move on to this. You master this, you move on to this. And then once your Latin gets better, then you can study other subjects. Now notice we're doing the catechism, and in the first two classes, the catechism instruction is in German. Now this document specifically directs the teachers to speak in Latin at all times, except for the catechism. Now, why? Why are we allowing German? Why are we reading the catechism in German? Why are we studying the catechism in German? Well, what's the student's native tongue? German. So we're going to start with a tongue that they know, so that when they're learning the catechism, they're going to understand it. They're going to understand it thoroughly. They're not worried about trying to translate the Latin. It's going to mean something to them. Now, once again, they've mastered the Latin, then we can begin to study the catechism in Latin. Okay, remember I told you how specific the instructions were? Here's an example. I know, can you read that? It's kind of small.
Can you read?
Yeah, so basically we're teaching spelling, so we're going to use the Pater Noster, which they should all know. So the teacher's going to say, and you notice as soon as the students come into the classroom, begin by saying, what is the first letter of pater? And they would chime in, P. Ask further, show me the same letter in the alphabet table. Right? So you're teaching the students letters based upon a text that they have memorized. Does everyone follow that? Okay. So you see how specific this is? And there's a special printing of the Große in 1559 that's even more specific. So it goes into declensions, conjugations, indicative, subjunctive, passive, active. I mean, it really, really is specific about how instructors should teach Latin grammar. So that tells me two things. One, it's very German, we're very comprehensive, we're very orderly, we want to make sure everything is standardized. And it also implies that what had been going on at the particular Schule level was not adequate. Students were not being taught Latin grammar effectively. Okay, so then again, you'll notice as we get into upper classes, we're going to add more advanced subjects. We're going to add rhetoric. We're going to add dialectic. We're going to focus on styles. We want students to be able to read, write, speak, think in Latin. And then when we get up to the fourth class, we're going to add Greek. And notice we're using classical texts. Now, the way the system worked is, for the most part, it was expected that students would go from the third class of the Partikularschulen to the Pedagogium. But that's only for the students who were intending to go to university. Probably most of the students would complete their education in the Partikularschulen, so they would go through all 5 classes, and they would be done. The more advanced, more gifted students would go 3 classes in the Partikularschulen, transfer to the Pedagogium, and then if you went to the Pedagogium in Tübingen, you were intended to do more advanced university studies after that. So there's a whole section, and I use the German here because, again, it really conveys more than the English translation word, von Gottes Furcht. Such a lovely word, Furcht. Right? It means fear or dread. So this is fear or dread of God. So it reminds me of the psalm, it's the motto of Concordia, Wisconsin, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So we want to make sure that students know this, and if you read this list, it is completely integrated into their curriculum. So every part of the school day, there is a place where we have religious instruction, and a lot of the emphasis is upon music. We want the students to know hymns, the liturgy. We want them to be able to participate in a meaningful way in the church service. So this is a lot of the emphasis. So again, that's very Lutheran, this emphasis upon music. Okay, are there any questions about that? The Partikularschulen. So it's really similar to the classical education model that we're seeing today, right? When you're teaching Latin in particular, you start with the basics, you work your way up, and then at some point you want to be able to communicate, in Latin. We don't speak it anymore, unfortunately. Okay, so just real quickly, the Tübingen Pedagogium. I spent a year here doing dissertation research. I'm quite fond of it. It's a lovely little city in Germany. This is the Altstadt, so this is the old part of the city. Can you see this right here? That's the Stiftskirche. It's connected to the university, so even today, if you would walk by the church, it has one of those little bulletin boards on there. The pastor is a professor of theology at the university. So that's who preaches at this particular church, so there's still a very close connection. So if you look at the Tübingen Pedagogium, it's the same progressive studies that we saw with the Partikularschulen. We're just working at a more advanced level. So again, Latin is preeminent. You have to know Latin. And it's classical Latin, not medieval Latin. And then we're going to add rhetoric and dialectic. And then you're going to find a lot of those subjects that showed up in the Renaissance. History, literature, poetry. For those of you who've been going to Dr. B's sessions, that's exactly why they included poetry in their curriculum. It was designed to teach moral lessons. Sometimes their meanings, moral lessons were more meaningful or more apparent in fiction than in real life. Okay, so this is the university ordinance. I'm going to have to move the mic here. This is the university. Remember I told you that the Duke had to negotiate separately with the university just because of the way the university was the semi-autonomous institution. But I want you to notice a couple, and I'm not going to translate this whole thing for you. But I want you to notice really what we're focusing on. For the expansion of God's grace, the right, true religion and faith, and for the general welfare of Christians. And we need to do this because we have to train people not only for the church, but for civil service. So we don't want civil servants who don't know anything about the faith, because otherwise they can't be faithful servants. So again, it's that idea of vocation that you see here. This particular form of education is important for all students, regardless of what career track they're going to be. So again, it's service to state and society and the church. Okay, and then this is the other interesting thing. Remember I told you the truth is very specifically defined in this educational program. So it's in the Grosse Kirchenordnung, but I'm going to point this out because of the university. This last part basically says that all professors, whatever faculty they're in, arts, medicine, law, theology, are going to have to adhere to the Augsburg Confession. And it's clearly articulated as a true expression of the apostolic and evangelical teachings. Does this sound familiar? Yes. Yeah, okay. And we're not going to tolerate any, I love this, verworfene Sekten und sakramentäre Lehre. No sacramentarians. Right? And again, when you think about where Wittenberg is, what is south of Wittenberg? What's that geographical space? In this particular, it's the Swiss cantons. And the Swiss cantons either were Catholic or they were, well, they started off Zwinglingen and then they became Calvinist. So you can see that this worry about sacramentarian teaching is a real concern and based upon where it's located, right? And if you go further west, you're in France. And France is Catholic, but Calvin was French. So he's training pastors for France, right? And that's it. So Württemberg has to be really concerned about that. And then there's always the Catholics that you have to worry about. On the east is Bavaria, which is really Catholic. It's still really Catholic to this day, particularly in some areas of it. So we're going to be very clear. So Christoph wanted to be very clear about what truth is the foundation for education in Württemberg. So I find this particular process in Württemberg fascinating. I've always had an interest in the connection between church and state and how education fits into that relationship. So what's really, and especially after we've had these conversations, and those of you who are just in Dr. Korkak's presentation where we basically spent most of the time bashing public education today, this is public education. This was established in Württemberg by the ducal governance. It's maintained, it's supervised, it's funded by the government. But again, because Christoph saw himself as Landesvater, his concern was to make sure that his subjects were properly educated in the faith. So this, in some ways, is the foundation for public education in the United States. It actually starts off as religious instruction. It's designed to inculcate students in the faith. It took kind of a detour in the 19th century and a really large detour in the 20th century, 20 and 21st centuries. But this is the context in which Lutheran education works, so it's helpful to know that larger historical context. Okay, are there any questions, comments? Yes?
Why is the visual arts not included? Is there a reason why they didn't study drawing?
Yeah, we've had conversations about that. It's kind of hard to answer. You know, if you look at the works of the Cranachs, I mean, obviously they use visual arts to the advantage of the Reformation. There's this wonderful propaganda piece that Cranach did about the true forms of worship, and it's like a panel on one side is Catholic worship, on the other side is Lutheran worship, and everything's wrong with Catholic, everything right with Lutheran. So visual arts obviously played a role in the Reformation, but I think for some reformers, because the Catholic Church was so visual, there are a lot of visual elements in the Catholic Church, they were concerned about confusing people. So there is some, what do we do with the visual arts? I don't know. The other thing is drawing, painting in the classical world was known as a servile art because you worked with your hands. I know. So it wouldn't have been part of higher education because it was not deemed, and this stigma is going to stay for a long time. There's a day if, your child wanted to be an artist, the parents would go, because, it's like you're saying, I wanted to shovel manure or something. So that's the best I can answer. Any other questions? Comments? If you have some questions that you don't want to ask in front of the whole group, I'll hang around up here for a while if you want to come up and talk to me. All right, thank you so much.